Hello and welcome everybody. The bank holiday has officially begun. So thank you everybody for joining us live, and I promise it will be worth it. My name is Mita and I manage the Young Trustees movement, and I'm also a former chair and trustee myself. Today we are chatting to Leon Ward, who is kind of a celebrity in the trustee world. So we're very lucky to have him here today. So Leon has been a trustee since he was 18 years old when he became a trustee of Plan International UK. On the back of this, Leon has gone on to publish and contribute to several young trustee guides, and has spent much of his career convincing boards about how and why they should recruit young trustees and helping them to implement board models to increase diversity. He's also currently deputy chair of Brook, and you may have read about him this week in our Spotlight story featured in our digital hub, and if you haven't already, please do read that because it is a good read. And we'll be interviewing him today with some questions that you asked us, but there'll also be time for some follow-up questions, so please do remember them because he'll be able to answer them. But first of all, we'd just love to know we'd love to know from everyone who's joined us, hear from everyone who's joined us today. So please do introduce a little bit about yourselves in the chat. While you're doing that as well, we've also heard Zoom is struggling a bit today. So if that is the case with you, do turn off your video. Apparently that helps. And everyone's got their video turned off anyway, so that's all good. I'd also like to introduce Meg. Meg, would you like to say hello and just introduce yourself and tell us why you're here today?
Hi, yeah, of course. So I'm Meg. If you haven't met me, I am the project coordinator at the Young Trustee movement, the Young Trustees movement. And I guess I'm here today. I haven't been a trustee before, and I am learning all about it as I go. So I'm really interested to hear the conversation and to learn from Leon and everyone here a bit more about it.
Great, thank you. So welcome, Leon, to this webinar. Today we are discussing what do young trustees do. So that's really exciting. Leon, how are you doing today?
Sorry, classic Zoom move where you forget to unmute yourself before you say the first word, but I'm fine, thanks. I think this is my 6th or 7th Zoom of the day, so like lots of people who are in work and are working from home, finding themselves a bit zoomed out, I suppose. I also just noticed before we connected just how much my beard has grown in the last couple of weeks. So it's,
I know, I'm seeing a lot of Zoom beards. I'm quite enjoying this.
Yeah.
And
laziness, to be honest. It's laziness more than style, I think.
Fair enough, fair enough. And a couple of people might be wondering, why is it that we're starting off with a question, what does a trustee do? And the reason for that is actually so common that people get appointed to trustee boards and then they turn up and they're like, they get their welcome guide and they're like, what am I actually doing? And that is completely normal, isn't it, Leon? Oh. I don't know whether it's my internet connection now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also really hard to kind of define. Oh, are we good to go?
We're good to go, yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, and also it's lots of people ask it with the kind of perception that it's the wrong question to ask. But I think before you embark on anything, you should ask the basic what is question and what is it that I'm going to do. I think it's really hard to try and summarize what trustees do in kind of one sentence, but I'll try and give it my best shot, which is, for me, trustees are volunteers. And I think that's important. They're the volunteer board members who help decide on the overall strategy and direction that an organisation is going. They are the guardians of public money, usually, because most charities receive public money in one form or another, whether that's donations from the public or through grants from government departments, whether they sell services to members of the public. 9 out of 10 times charities get public money through one way or another. And I think the key part of the role, or the key distinction of the role between being a paid member of staff and being a trustee, is that you're heads in and hands out, which is, I think, a really powerful way of explaining what it means your head is there to guide the charity, to offer critique, to be, you might have heard the term a critical friend, but you're not there to do the actual day-to-day operation. So you might decide that in 5 years you want your organisation to achieve X, but you're not the person that makes that happen. That is down to the executive to do. And I think, just to close, which is way longer than a line actually, that I think it's really rich that for the voluntary sector in England and Wales and the wider UK, you have to have volunteers running the organisation. I think that says a lot about the ethos and the kind of mentality behind volunteering in the sector.
Thanks for that, Leon. And thanks for that summary. And now we're going to jump into some of the questions asked by members on the Digital Hub about that they want to know with regards to this topic. But before I do, I just wanted to highlight that England and Wales, where we're creating this guidance for, have different regulations and a different regulator to Scotland and Northern Ireland. Some of the principles are broadly the same, but if you have Scottish or Northern colleagues from Scotland or Northern Ireland, it's best to refer them to their own regulator. So just wanted to put that kind of legal stance on there before we dig in. So one of the first questions, Leon, was how much time does it take to fulfill your trustee duties?
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's no set answer. So every organisation varies, and I know that we're going to talk about the difference between smaller and bigger charities later. Typically, I would argue that smaller organisations tend to require more time, often because there's less paid staff, so the work gets split amongst the volunteers a bit more. In terms of kind of best practice, I would say that most organizations hold 2 to 3 hour meetings 4 times a year. That's probably the absolute baseline to meet your sort of regulatory duties as a trustee, but it can completely vary, and it depends on how much you want to throw yourself into it as well, because if you join a subcommittee, that's inevitably going to take time. If you decide to work on a particular project, that's going to take more time. You also need to count for the fact that you have prep time, which is probably a couple of hours for every meeting, and travel time, although this might change now post-coronavirus. We might not all be travelling for trustee meetings, which would actually lift one of the big barriers that young people face in being trustees. So if we just do some simple maths, if you have 4 meetings a year for 2 hours each plus prep time, I would say the minimum is probably 20-ish hours, 16 to 20 hours. And I think I saw some research recently which shows that most charities expect between 20 and 30 hours. So the bare minimum is just about getting to that, but actually organizations will more than likely take a bit of extra time from you.
And do you have any kind of like top tips on like how you might set some of the boundaries in there, or how you might ask the person that you are, when you're in the interview process, about how to manage that and communicate that?
I think it's about, first and foremost, being really honest with what your expectation is from the role and what you can give to the role. If you can only give 20 hours a year, then I think you should say that probably in your application stage, and say, just because of where I am in my life at the moment, this is what I can do face to face, and this is what I can do remotely. I think if you start the conversation with that expectation, then actually it's for you to manage increase and decrease as you flux. And I think that's the other thing as well. If some of you are students, and I think reading from the chat, some of you might be students, then clearly there are times in your year, for instance, when you can give more time. So over the summer, you might think, great, I can give more time to the organisation because I've got time to do it. Equally, in working life, there are times when you need to flex the amount of time that you can give. I think it's about also, if any of you are making speculative applications, which take a lot of time, often for little reward, but I know people do them still, it's worth saying at that point as well, look, I can give between 20 and 30 hours a year, or a couple of hours a month, or an hour a week, or whatever it is. Just because sometimes for some organisations, trusteeship isn't necessarily the right way into your volunteering journey. Actually, if you want to do some due diligence, being a volunteer at that charity, doing other voluntary stuff, like the more hands-on stuff, can be a really good way to test your fit with the organisation, and for you to do some of that kind of internal networking and saying, if you start volunteering for an organisation, you get to meet the staff. Eventually, you can have a conversation about whether joining the board would be appropriate. So I think you need to decide pretty early on and be open and honest with it pretty early on what you think you can give. And for those of you that are in a state of flux, i.e. if you're thinking of moving in a couple of years, or again, you're studying and you're going to be leaving the city or town that you grew up in and moving to a different town or city, then I think you need to be open and honest about that upfront as well, and say, you know, I'm gonna go work abroad for a year in 2 years' time, just so the organisation knows what to expect from you and can start kind of succession planning at the right time, really. And I think typically I would take the approach that people don't normally like surprises. So you might have to have some difficult conversations through your trustee journey, but that is way easier and way better than launching with a surprise.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And we, in the movement as well, one of the pieces of campaigning we try to do as well is to get people who are recruiting for trustees to be flexible with their times and think about how that might impact others. And in the now, there is that space of like, how are you navigating these conversations to ensure that you are setting yourself up for where that space is convenient for you, and you're communicating with them as well. So hopefully in the future,
I think,
sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's a really difficult thing to do. Like, I think it's really hard as well to put yourself out there and say, by the way, your current structures or your current meeting timetable don't work for most people, which is why everyone around your board looks the same, sounds the same, and has the same background. Like, to put yourself out on a pedestal like that is a really uncomfortable way for many people to start their trustee journey. So if you are feeling a bit uncomfortable about that, then please know you are with allies in the network who have also felt that throughout our trustee career. You know, I've been a trustee for 10 years, and sometimes still I have to say, I can't make that work, or I can't afford the price to whatever fundraiser it is that I've been invited to for my organization. Like, and to do that is really uncomfortable, but actually that's one of the key reasons they need new voices around the board.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. Like, when you're in that situation, it's not, the responsibility isn't on you to make all those changes. If people in the boardroom are making those changes and making that accessible, that is their responsibility. And know that you have this community to draw on support whenever you feel like you want to ask anybody any questions or how to navigate those situations. So Leon, you kind of touched on this previously as well, but would you have anything to add to the question, what is the difference between a paid member of staff and a trustee?
Yeah, well, the key difference, let's start with the most obvious one, which is money. So trustees don't get paid. You shouldn't be being paid anyway. If you are, then you're probably not a trustee, so that's worth checking. I guess the key difference is really around trustees are really there to provide thought and to provide guidance and to provide stretch and challenge. And to say to an organisation, I understand that you want to do this piece of work over here, but it seems a little bit at odds with what the charity was set up for, or the strategic direction that we're going in, or whatever it happens to be. I think as well, you're there to, as I say, offer a litmus test to the charity. So if the charity does want to try new and different things, it's a really good idea. And I say this to staff at Brook, bring it to the board first, because we are a good panel of people to litmus test this with before you then go out to the public. I also think there's something around the guardianship of the organisation that I take really seriously, which is that I hold the organisation up to a mirror of values and make sure that it's meeting its registered charity objectives. I'm not somebody that says you can't do new things, but for instance, if you are a sexual health charity like Brook is, and we started to do work that wasn't about sexual health, but still about, let's say, relationships, for instance, because the two used to be separated. If we were registered at the Charity Commission and it said to provide sexual health guidance, that limits us. We've actually since changed that, and now it says, I think it's providing sex and relationships advice for any person anywhere or something like that, because we also didn't want to restrict ourselves by age, because we've realized as an organization that a 32-year-old has quite a lot in common with a 25-year-old. Why would we not see them at the clinic doors? Historically, we wouldn't have been able to. So it's about questions like that, trustees taking risks at appropriate times, stopping risks from being taken at appropriate times as well, and just sense checking those ideas. And I think placing restrictions on staff activity sometimes is a key thing that trustees have to do too. I guess the other thing that trustees tend to be better at than staff is horizon scanning. I find that trustees, because you're not kind of mingling with the day-to-day stuff, the day-to-day operations of the organisation you're a trustee of, it's easy for you to take a step back and just look at what's going on and what's coming over the horizon and what challenges are coming in the next couple of years. And obviously the last key difference between the two roles is that the paid staff do the doing. And I think that's really hard to get your head around, but as I say, they are the ones that are hands in. So if you're launching a new digital product, they create it, they brand it, they decide on how it goes. Certainly in bigger organizations, there is a slight caveat there that in smaller organizations, you might be expected to do a little more. I think it's really important, if you are going to be a trustee of a small organization, that each project you work on as a trustee has set parameters, so you realize when you're stepping slightly out of your trustee role and more into a volunteer role, you can still do other voluntary projects for your organization. Of course you can. You can run marathons if you want to, you can help run events, fine. But I think it's really important that you distinguish when you're deciding and having conversations with your trustee hat on, or when you're making decisions and having conversations with your other volunteering hat on. I think that's probably a fairly comprehensive summary of the difference between the two.
Yeah, thank you for that, Leon. And one of the reasons why I love this question is because so many trustee boards at the minute don't actually get that right. It's a really sometimes hard balance to keep. So to ask yourself the question, what is a trustee, constantly is really important to ensure that you're actually fulfilling that duty and not stepping on the toes of staff members.
And I think, staff that are really well versed in governance will also push back to boards, because sometimes you want to get involved in a project because you're just really excited with what the project is. Like, I've been really excited by some of the stuff Brooke's doing. I'm like, can I get involved? And they're like, no, you need to step back, because you do have to have those boundaries between you. And it's about protecting them and protecting the board as well, especially in such a big organization. And I think it's also about protecting your time, because it's so easy to get swept up in really cool stuff, especially if you're slightly younger. And I say that without being patronizing. I'm 28 for those of you that are watching, but I remember when I was 21, I wanted to literally do everything, because I was like, this is really interesting, it's going to help my career, it's going to allow me to contribute in a different way. It's like tick tick tick, yes yes yes, I'll do everything you need me to do. And I was practically working a full-time job for some of the weeks when I was at Plan. And I would advise you not to do that, but to try and be a bit pickier with the opportunities that you take, and that actually being a trustee at your age, whatever your age you are, is something that's quite unique anyway. So that's enough to set you aside from your competitors when you're going into the job market. And I know that there'll be some of you out there saying, I don't do this to try and set myself aside from the crowd, but everyone absolutely does get involved in the sector for things other than just being motivated by kind of the cause. There is, of course, a selfish element to trusteeship. It's professional volunteering. Why else? Why that's why lots of people do it.
Thank you for that, Leon. The next question is, what is the difference between an NED and a trustee?
Good question. And again, it's not very clear cut, so I'll try my best. I guess it's probably easier to think of the economy in three sectors, which you probably do anyway: public sector, private sector, and the not-for-profit sector. I don't call it the third sector because I think that's derogatory, because we're a big economic player. And I think you can have NEDs in all three of those. And NEDs, trustees, governors, assembly members, all those sorts of titles are often used interchangeably. And I guess what you need to do to try and work out what the difference is in practice, or when you're looking at those words, is look at the words around it. So lots of NED roles, which just means non-executive directorship, are unpaid, or in certain sectors, paid roles, but they're still board roles. So the co-op, for instance, if you ever shopped at the co-op, they have a board of non-exec directors. Each one earns something between like £70,000 and £80,000. It's a great gig if you can get it, because it's more than a full-time salary for most people for just being essentially a sort of trustee or governor of the organisation. So again, they are people that are heads in, hands out, asking the big picture questions, asking about the strategy, holding the feet of the staff's holding the feet of the staff to the fire around all the topics that they're talking about. But it's really hard to give you a kind of dictionary definition, because they're the same. I suppose one thing that is the same is that they're non-executive, so they're not staff. So when we talk about the difference between being a trustee and being an executive, the language is there a bit more interchangeable once you've got your head around that, I suppose. And actually, you will use different language according to who you're talking to. So I've used the word NED before because I was talking to some housing associations, and their trustees are called non-executive directors, or board members, or governors, or whatever. The words are interchangeable. But I think once you understand how it works in each sector, it's a bit clearer. Also, public bodies, hospitals, Ofcom, the regulators, the Charity Commission, they all have board members. Often they're called non-executive directors as well. So just to say that it's all sectors use them interchangeably. And I guess it's about you getting your head around the language to then be able to follow the conversations that you're in.
Thanks, Leon. And when people start, when they've just been appointed to a trustee, they usually get sent the Essential Trustee Guide. And I remember getting this guide, going out with my yellow highlighter, and then just feeling really overwhelmed, being like, I don't get it. So could you bring some of this guide to life for us? What does it practically mean?
So if you are first of all, the fact you got sent the Essential Trustee is a huge improvement from where we were before, because people were becoming trustees and being registered with the Charity Commission and not receiving any communication from the Commission. And that happened for years. And there's been some of us in the sector that have been pushing for that to change for ages. So one, I'm really pleased you've got it. Two, I'm not so pleased to hear that actually it feels quite overwhelming, which of course it will. That's because, of course, the assumption is if you've decided to be a trustee, you probably fit the typical bracket of being 50 plus white male and had a really interesting long-winded executive career. I think for any of you that are thinking about trusteeship or aspiring, I noticed someone in the comments say they're an aspiring trustee, the Essential Trustee is essentially your kind of law and rule book. It sets out what the role of a trustee is for you. Whenever you are questioning any decisions you're making or the role, it's a really good place to start because it outlines when you are doing right. So things like making sure your charity carries out its public benefit. What that means is, what is your charity registered to do, and is it doing it? If it's not, then either you need to change what it's set out its public benefit as, and that, like I said earlier, changes, and it does change. For instance, if you're a local food bank, but then you want to start providing education on food nutrition, but your charitable objectives say you are there to distribute food parcels, there is a slight gap there, and you need to marry those two up. And the Essential Trustee guides you through those sorts of things. There is another which is around who can be a trustee. So it tells you what bars you from being a trustee, whether you've had a previous criminal conviction, if you're of a particular age, because the youngest age of trusteeship in the UK is 16, but that's only of charities that are incorporated. And the reason that is, and I realise this is quite corporate language, but the reason that is because then your liability is protected. So if the charity goes bust, essentially you're only liable for whatever amount it says you're liable for in the governing document of the charity. So at Brook it's £1. In most organisations it's less than £10. I think the Essential Trustee as well is written by a regulator, it's published by the regulator. So in terms of trying to find your way through all of the best practice guides that are out there and all of the advice, that should be your starting point, because it, like I say, sets out the stall for what you need to be doing. Now, I would summarise the Essential Trustee as a little bit about what we've done about what a trustee is. And also, if you act in good faith in the best interest of your charity, which we'll talk about in a moment, because the best interest of the charity might be different to your interests or the interest of your board, then you are largely going to be okay, unless you are committing a crime and stealing money or helping other people steal money. Then largely you're going to be okay in terms of if the commission is ever going to step in and kind of get in touch with you about anything that you're doing. So yeah, that's probably how I would try and summarize the Essential Trustee, which is, I think it's definitely over 100 pages. So I hope that's helpful.
That is really helpful. And I think the key distinction for me, and advice I would give anybody going into this, is the kinds of roles and duties in there isn't like you have to know all of the rules and regulations related to this. It's you have to be asking the questions, and that is such a big difference. I think helps to not be overwhelmed by the weight of the responsibility. It's asking the questions. You don't have to know all the answers.
And I think it's about understanding it's a shared responsibility. Like on my board, I think, I think we're 9 trustees now, maybe 10. I think we've just recruited some. But actually, it's all 10 of us operating collegiately that own the kind of ethos of the essential trustee, which is act in the best interest, use reasonable care and skill, make sure that you're carrying out public benefit. It's not just on you as one individual trustee. It's about all of you coming together under the leadership of a decent chair, should I say, hopefully a decent chair, who makes sure that you're kind of shepherded through the process properly. You don't have to be an expert on day one. I would also say, for those of you that are looking at becoming trustees pretty quickly, or are in your first year or 2 of being a trustee, it takes a year to get your feet under the table, no matter how experienced you are, and even no matter how well you know the organisation, because you don't know the history, the context, or the politics of the boardroom, and it takes a decent whack of time to get to grips with that. And if you're an organisation that meets 4 times a year for 2 hours, that's not a lot of time to try and understand everything that's gone before you. 8 hours is not a huge amount of time to try and navigate all of that, whilst having imposter syndrome because you're the youngest, usually the poorest, and usually the least experienced day job wise in the room. Like, there's a lot going on for you in your first year or 2 as a trustee. So I think, like, take the pressure off you a little bit. If you've read The Essential Trustee, you are probably more well read than 60-70% of trustees out there. So the fact that, you know, this came up as a question really does give me faith and hope.
Brilliant. Thank you, Leon. We have a couple more questions, but I actually want to move on to...
Mita, you're just muted, so we missed the end of that question.
Oh, great. Thank you. Where did you hear me from, Meg?
Just that there's a couple of questions, but you want to move on to something and we don't know what.
Okay, yeah, keeping you all in suspense. Yeah, there's a couple more questions that people ask, which Meg will cover in some of, she'll explain how she'll cover that later. But for now, I want to move on to the people in this chat. So if you're happy to ask a question yourself, please put in the chat that I'm happy to ask this question, or if you would like Meg to ask the question for you, then please let Meg know. So please put in the chat now if you're happy to ask a question.
I know that Olivia and Megan are both happy to ask their questions. So Olivia, do you want to go first? I've just unmuted you.
Hi everyone, thank you for this. I'm really glad I found out about it today. I just wanted to ask, so I'm involved in a few various charities and things, and I wonder how you'd advise me perhaps bringing up the idea or benefits of having a young trustee on the board. So like how you'd kind of perhaps would have that discussion.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a hard one to answer as well, because without knowing the context and the kind of personalities of every individual around your board table, it's almost impossible to give you a bespoke answer. But what we can do is after this chat separately, if you like, to work this out. But I would say that you now have a movement that you're part of, that the sector is waking up to, that I think you can flag, rather than necessarily saying, I'm a young person who thinks there should be young trustees around your board. I think it's about shifting the argument slightly and saying, look, the sector, the charity sector as a whole, is moving in this direction. There are funders that are doing this. The pressure from the regulator is there. They're very keen on young trustees. I think if you position it like that, that's a really good starting point. I would say that there is a natural window in the calendar, in the charity calendar every year, which is Trustees Week and or Volunteers Week, to raise these things, partly because people are always happy during those weeks because they're celebrating all the good stuff that's going on, but also it sort of fits, do you know what I mean? Like, you're linking to a wider theme than the organisation that you're working in. Or, depending how brave and kind of upfront you want to be, just speak to the, depending who your connection is, the chief exec or someone in the paid staff team. But remember that it's the board that make decisions about the board. So if you know one of the trustees or know the chair, that is who I would probably be targeting. And targeting sounds very aggressive, but you do need to be aggressive around some of this if you really want to get stuff done.
Brilliant, thank you for that. That's really helpful.
I would just add as well that next week, it's a bit of a plug, but next week, so each week we have a theme, and next week's theme is why do we need young trustees? So if you come back next week as well, there'll be more stuff on that you can use as a bit of evidence.
And also, Olivia, I would say that most organisations that are nervous about this are nervous for it for one reason, and that's because they think you're trying to turn them into youth workers, which is not what you're doing, because I think the type of person who wants to put themselves around a board is a very particular type of person who probably doesn't need a huge amount of youth work. Now, that's not being derogatory to people who wouldn't want to be around a board, but it's just a type of volunteering. It's a different type. There are others who want to go in and pet animals as they're volunteering. I can imagine anything worse than doing that. Like, this is not about saying it's us versus them. It's about saying, look, diverse decision making is always better decision making. Yes, it's a bit harder, but just so you know, there's people that have been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years who have learned all the lessons there are to learn. And there's guides galore that can help you navigate this. You're not starting from scratch. So I think just bear that in mind, that often there's an apprehension to work with young people on boards because they think you're going to need hand-holding way more than you actually will.
Great, thank you, and thanks, Leon. Megan, are you happy to ask your question now? I'll just unmute you.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the session. It's been really informative. It's something that I've only recently started learning about, so it's a great way to start. My question, I hope it's not too simplistic, but it was just, how would you suggest finding the best trustee role matched with your own skill sets?
Yeah, great question, Meg, or Megan. I think the first thing you need to do is work out what skill set you're offering. And I think you might think you know yourself really, really well, but actually when you are on a board and you do a skills audit and you look at the skills around the table, one of the best things to do is to ask your trustees to identify the top 2 skills they're bringing. So I think once you've done that, you then need to work out which organisations you want to go for. So if you're really interested in young people's mental health, then that is going to narrow your search down enormously, which is very helpful for you targeting your search. I think you also then need to kind of just start doing your research. So if you go on doit.org, for instance, which is a volunteering matching website, lots of smaller local organisations advertise their roles on that, and they will often say in the description, we need you to have finance skills and digital skills and governance skills and marketing skills. Replace the and with or, because I can guarantee you every organisation that puts and don't actually mean that. They mean they want you to have one of those skills, but often you'll think, Christ, who are they talking about if they want all of those things? And I think when you see those sorts of ads, ignore them and just replace the word with or. Unless they are requiring those superstars, then they're probably never going to find someone who's good at all of those things. And then I think, so once you've got skills, cores, and you start doing your research, you can then see and just start looking at charity adverts to see what sort of skill sets they're looking for, because it does change. At the moment, loads of charities are putting out there, we want digital and tech, digital and tech, digital and tech, obviously, because there are some trustees where and charities that don't even know how to use Zoom. But that it will change, like post the virus, the skill set that people require will also shift. But I think if you can say in your covering letter, hi, I'm this person, I've got this background, and these are the 2 top skills I think I will bring to your table, as well as a diverse perspective and a different context and blah, 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 then you're gonna immediately set yourself aside from other applicants who are going to be really airy-fairy. And I think also I would advise you when you're applying for these, and I've seen some questions in the chat about applications, is to try and be as direct as you can. I hate it when people say like volunteering and trusteeship's in my DNA, because that doesn't, 1, it's not, and 2, it's just so meh. I would much rather you say, I've got these 2 great skills and I think your organisation is looking for those from what I've read in the paperwork. If you're making a speculative application though, and you're interested in an organisation but you've not seen any adverts for trustees, but you've seen other adverts for volunteers, I would use that as my carrot to get in touch with the organisation and say, I can do these things for you. I can't quite do what you've asked for option C, but I'm willing to learn. I think that's also a key thing in your applications. And when you're working this out, is what skill set do you want to learn? Because that might help decide what type of organisation you go for. The reality is most of you are not going to be on the board of UNICEF by the end of the year, but there are hundreds, well, there are actually thousands, about 184,000 registered charities in England and Wales, organisations out there that are not UNICEF that still need trustees. So there are lots of local and smaller organisations who are more open to having a young trustee because they realise they struggle to attract the skill set. So I realise that the question goes slightly beyond what you asked, but I was just trying to marry up some of the other comments in the chat.
Thank you. That was really, really helpful, I think. And there's one more question that I've seen. So if Josh, you want to ask it, and then if anyone else has got questions, just let us know in the chat box. Or if I've missed your question, just say something. Josh, you are unmuted, I think.
Thank you. So thank you, Leon, for sharing your experience. It's been really informative so far.
Great.
I was just wondering, really, what advice do you have for aspiring trustees?
Aspiring trustees. So, I mean, some of the advice I just shared then for Megan is part of it. I think, yeah, working out kind of what your skill set is, the organisations you're interested in, and the kind of stage of the organisation. So are you interested in startups, or do you want an organisation that's been on the planet for 150 years? Up to you. I think be realistic about your search. I would read the Essential Trustee as an aspiring trustee, so that, because what they'll try and do, or what I've seen organisations do when they interview young trustees, is try and catch them out with a governance question. Because they don't expect you to know a lot about governance, and 9 out of 10 times I've seen young trustees smash that question because they've read the Essential Trustee, or they've done research or attended webinars like this. I think if you can upskill yourself in the area where they think you will be the weakest, you will perform better in interview, you'll feel more confident when applying, and they won't catch you out. And it comes up every trustee interview almost that I've been a part of, and I actually was in an interview last week for another trusteeship that I'm interested in. They asked me the question, what is the difference between staff and trustees? Do you understand the difference? So I think getting your head around that and looking at some working examples of that would really help you. I think try and get to know the sector a little bit, and by that I guess I mean like read the sector news, so have a look at third sector and civil society, and just start to get a sense check of what the sector is saying, because again that will give you nuggets to be able to use in interview. So if they ask you a question about, I don't know, trusts and foundations, I read something the other day which was saying that trusts and foundations are worried that their investments might not recover for a while, so there's not going to be huge amounts of money for organisations to apply for. I only know that because I read that article, but then when a question comes up about funding, at least I've got something to go for. So I suppose it's, yeah, getting involved in the sector a little bit more that way, and academically, because the people who interview you, if you're going for the big charities, are probably sector nerds, and actually you need to kind of, you know, level the playing field a little bit. I also think that if you've not volunteered before, volunteering as a route into trusteeship is a really powerful route. If you see trusteeship as the sort of graduation from your volunteering, it can really help you develop your skills as a volunteer and to understand the politics of an organisation. And largely, most organisations have largely the same big political issues. Okay, there are different variances because of the context, but everyone's worried about money, everyone's worried about demand, but actually seeing that in practice and being able to, with speed and with comfort, own those topics, I think will set you in a really good stead for when you get to interview stage. I could give you loads of tips about how to find these job roles and whatever, but the sorts of people that I think are on the call, the fact you're part of the network, you seem pretty astute enough to be able to do that. So hopefully those tips are some things that you might not have considered doing before.
And yeah, and also just to add to that, next month we'll be covering the theme of like how can you apply for a trustee position, and what does that mean as a young trustee. Meg, do we have any more questions on the chat, or shall we go back to some of the other questions?
I think there's one more question, and also Josh is muted, but he says thank you. I think that's important too.
Welcome.
Caroline, do you want to ask your question?
Hi. Yeah, I was just struck by what you said, Leon, about the fact that a year is not long enough to get to know an organisation, but I've seen in some guides for young trustees particularly that the year is an ideal amount of time, so that then you can kind of, it's good for the young person because often people are kind of moving around more at a young age, and then also for the organisation so that they can keep getting a kind of a genuinely kind of young voice, you know, a new kind of voices, and giving more people opportunities. So I don't know, how does that, do you firmly sit on the, you have to be there longer than a year camp, or is it sometimes all right to just be there for a year?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely fine to be there for a year. And actually, I think in the Young Trustees Guide I wrote, I said that at Plan, we had young observers that sat for a year. And what we were doing with the young observers, which was different to the young trustee, and this was because we were kind of working out the thinking about this, was that we wanted to create a constituency of people to replace me when I decided to leave Plan. And so we thought observers who had observed for a year would have at least got to know some of the basics of trusteeship, like how to ask a question. How do trustees actually make decisions? Do they vote on stuff? What are the rules, and how long are meetings, and what do the papers look like? And that sort of kind of basic logistical stuff, which is important to get your head around. I think that if you really, really want to know an organisation well, you do need longer than a year. Having said that, if you have come up through a youth advisory panel or through a connection to the charity, you might be able to bunny hop that a little bit because you're already engaged in the organisation. The other thing that I would say is that if you are in a role for a year, still try and have maximum impact, still try and have maximum learning, because then when you go to your next trusteeship and you get a 3-year or 4-year term, you're going to have a year to be able to get to know everything that your organisation's doing. And as I say, kind of do that due diligence and get to understand the kind of history and the politics of the organisation. But I would argue that as a full trustee, a year is probably too short. But listen, if it gets you on the board and it's right for your life at the time, then heck, go for it. Like, absolutely, because your trustee career is only just starting. You're probably going to be a trustee for the next 30, 40 years. So it doesn't matter if you serve on a couple that are for a year or 2 years or less than perhaps what the best practice is. I think anything that gets you around the boardroom and helps win the argument for young trustees is a thing that's worth doing. Does that answer your question?
Oh, Meg, you're muted, I think. Were you saying something?
I was saying that I was on meeting Caroline, ironically. Caroline,
Yeah,
does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it was interesting. It's just there are different kind of grants, isn't it? But obviously, yeah, the longer you stay, the better you would get to know it. But good to know that you think you could still have an impact.
Yeah, and it depends on you as a person, I suppose. I mean, also what I would say is actually it depends on the onboarding process. So if you sit a year and you have 2 days of induction, I would argue you'd pretty quickly get to grips with the organisation. There are some tips that I can give you around helping you get up to speed quicker. One is asking for a mentor when you join the board from within that boardroom, because then you can contact that person separately and say, oh, person X was really combative about that point. Do you know why? Is there some background that I'm missing? What was the last conversation that you had about this particular topic? Just so you can do that sort of, it's not, I mean, it is informal, but just so you can do that sort of sense checking, because often I've been in the boardroom and I can't get my head around why one of the trustees is really anti the point that the chief executive is making. I've fallen asleep during the organisation, or I've missed bits. And the reality is I've missed it because they had this conversation a year ago. So if you get a mentor, I think that's a really good thing to do. I also think trying to build a relationship with the chair so that you can ask these questions is another good way of kind of making the best use of that 1 year. So ringing the chair and saying, I want to make a point about this. I'm not sure if it's a too obvious point or if you've considered it in your thinking before I joined the board, but do you think this is the sort of right, am I on the right lines? Like, I think it's perfectly fine to show your vulnerabilities as a trustee and to be able to ask for help. But just having a mate in the room who can help guide you through that political stuff is really helpful.
Yeah, thank you for that, Leon. And I think we've had a lot of people share as well when they've been in their first year of trusteeship. They've been feeling like they're just finding their feet, they're not sure what's going on, but actually loads of the questions that they've asked in that process has made the board much more efficient as a whole. So for instance, like, how do you all read these board papers? And they're like standing there like, we're not quite sure. And then all of a sudden you see a board paper which is much more efficient to read for everyone else. So there's a thing around like how you are actually helping the board. Well, generally through coming back to this question, what does a trustee do? How do they work? And then you're also adding value in that way. And finding your feet takes time, and just to give yourself permission to have that time.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. And you know, everyone has their own different variations and versions. There are some board meetings I've sat in because I'm speaking to their board about young trustees, and I thought, oh yeah, I could add to that conversation. I've been in there 10 minutes, but then there are going to be other situations and contexts and scenarios where I'm not going to be able to contribute fully. And I think if you're going to go for these roles, you need to set yourself up in the best way possible to achieve as much as you can.
And on that note, that is all we have time for today. I feel like the time has just flown by. So thank you very much, Leon. It's clear that you have so much experience, and we're so grateful to have you on here today. And I'm really excited to announce as well that Leon will be hosting some of the webinars that are upcoming, which is really exciting for everyone and for you. The next webinar will be with Jonathan, who is a young trustee of the Dysphaxia Foundation and is the Young Trustees Movement Ambassador for the Northwest. And Meg, do you want to just say a little bit about what to expect tomorrow and also to expect next week?
Of course. Firstly, I'll just say thank you to Leon. I learned quite a lot as well, and it's been really lovely to read all your introductions to each other in the comments, and for all your questions. Thank you for engaging and making it such an interesting conversation. And how to find out more. So tomorrow I will be posting all the research that I've done about this week's questions that were sent to us on Monday. So every Monday what happens is we announce the theme of the week, and you can post in the Digital Hub any questions you have about that theme. I will then take those questions away, busy myself researching them, and on a Friday you'll be able to find the answers to your questions, as well as having a Q&A session on Thursday evenings at 5:30, where you can learn more and kind of engage a bit more in the discussion as well. So tomorrow you'll be able to log into the Hub and hopefully find a really good summary of everything that we've just learned then.
Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for your questions too. If you have any more, send them through and I will do my best to answer them. And I think, Olivia, I said to you, if you want to take this conversation offline about your organisation, then let me know.
Mita, you are muted. So close to the end.
I keep doing that. And you can find Leon here next week answering your questions and also hosting this with Jonathan. He'll also be on the Digital Hub, and I think it'd be really nice just to end before you leave and just put in the chat maybe one thing, the most valuable thing that you've learnt today. I'm gonna and while you do that, I'm going to mute ourselves and stop our videos. But just thank you so much for coming, because you, by being here, by turning up, by doing the research and doing the work, you are really changing what it means to have a sector that is more efficient through working towards becoming a young trustee or being an ally to other young trustees, or if you're a young trustee yourself, improving your knowledge. So thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you on the Digital Hub and next week.
Yeah.